This is East Asia Tonight.
Good Friday evening. I'm Otelia with tonight's top stories. Well, Japan's capital braces for Typhoon Ampil. Residents urged to exercise extreme caution. The storm already lashing Tokyo's remote islands with powerful winds and rain. The Philippines makes it clear its activities abroad are for defense and not aimed at any other country. Our correspondent spells out Manila's latest foreign policy objectives. China's top diplomat Wang Yi pledges support for a democratic transition in Myanmar and backs a regional plan to resolve its ongoing crisis. And elsewhere in Asia, Paetongtarn Shinawatra becomes Thailand's youngest prime minister at 37. She's the third member of a family to hold the nation's top job. Ahead on East Asia Tonight, following lengthy delays, the removal of radioactive debris at the crippled Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant could begin as early as this month. It's the start of what could be a decades-long marathon effort. Well, we'll be speaking to an expert on the challenges that lie ahead. The Japanese capital, Tokyo, hunkering down as Typhoon Ampil nears. Forecasters warn that it's a very strong storm, and residents have been urged to exercise extreme caution, with evacuation orders also issued for over 300,000 people in the Iwaki and Fukushima prefectures. Well, in an accelerated video captured by satellite, the storm is seen barreling towards Japan's main island of Honshu. It's now packing winds of about 200 kilometers per hour, with Ampil's eye right at the doorstep of Tokyo. Well, sped up footage of the Tokyo skyline showing dark clouds from Ampil's bands rolling in. While the typhoon is not expected to make landfall, heavy rains are already lashing the area, posing potential danger. The public has been warned to stay alert for violent winds, high waves, floods, and mudslides. Hundreds of flights have already been cancelled, affecting more than 100,000 passengers. Many rail services have been suspended as well, including major bullet train routes. Power has been knocked out for more than 1,700 homes in Tokyo's neighboring prefectures. Well, the disruptions come in a holiday week when millions typically return to their hometowns. The storm is expected to strengthen as it moves northwards, carrying winds powerful enough to knock down some homes. A study recently linked climate change to stronger typhoons in the region, blaming it for the storms forming closer to coastlines, intensifying more rapidly and lasting longer over land. The Foreign Affairs Secretary of the Philippines says his country's external engagements are not aimed at any other country. Enrique Manalo spoke to foreign correspondents at a forum in Manila, and he stressed that the engagements are for the defense and security benefit of the Philippines. His comments come amid heightened tensions with Beijing over competing claims in the South China Sea. Right, for more, let's turn to CNA's Buena Banal, live from Metro Manila. Buena, just give us what are some of the key takeaways from the Foreign Secretary Enrique Manalo at this event that you're at?
Well, Philippine Secretary of Foreign Affairs Enrique Manalo, in addressing the foreign correspondents in Manila, said that there were some 47 activities that the Department of Foreign Affairs engaged in, with other countries and other high-level officials thus far this year. Now, he was pressed as to why the Philippines has been aggressive in conducting these engagements, even if it knows that none of these activities pressure China in any way to backpedal in its aggression in the South China Sea. And Mr. Manalo said that these activities are not aimed at any one particular country. Now, I further followed up on the Secretary to ask whether he feels that the fear of some observers are valid in terms of Chinese influence creeping in the Philippine economy, in terms of the utility sector in particular, and whether he feels that the Philippines' sole military treaty ally, United States, should invest more heavily in the Philippine economy and not just in the Philippine military establishment to sort of counter this Chinese influence. But again, the Secretary deflected on that question to explain that these activities are about ensuring the Philippines' economic resilience, economic security so that it is able to adapt or address any emerging situations in the future without exactly outlining what these situations are. Now, while the secretary did say essentially that this is not about China, inevitably, discussions led to the South China Sea, and that is because of the increasing tensions in the past year and a half, which saw an unprecedented level last June 17, when a Filipino Navy personnel was severely injured, lost his thumb in what the Philippines has called a brutal assault by China that has been the most aggressive in recent history. And these tensions kept increasing even as the Philippine security framework pivoted from addressing internal security threats such as the communist insurgency in the Philippines, as well as some local terrorist groups in conflict-affected areas in southern Philippines, to addressing external security threats such as ensuring Philippine sovereignty in the West Philippine Sea, which is how the Philippines calls its maritime zone in the larger South China Sea.
Well, so Philippines says, it's not about China, but there is still rising tensions in the South China Sea. What then is the Philippine Foreign Ministry doing at the moment to manage that?
Well, the Philippines Foreign Affairs Secretary Enrique Manalo did say that the country is considering or still studying demanding compensation from China over that June 17 incident. And if you recall, the armed forces of the Philippines previously said that it has submitted a letter to the Defense Secretary Gilberto Teodoro Jr. that the estimate for the losses in terms of Philippine military assets during that June 17 incident is at about 60 million Philippine pesos. That's around over $1 million US. But the Philippines is also looking into demanding compensation for the surgery of that Filipino Navy sailor. And the Secretary of Foreign Affairs said that the agencies, the relevant agencies, are still working on that estimate. Now, I asked the Philippines Secretary of Foreign Affairs if he felt frustrated as to why, or if the Philippine agencies can expedite that estimate. And he just replied by saying that these agencies are, quote, working as fast as they can. Now, of course, July 2 was the bilateral consultation mechanism between the Philippines and China, and that would have been the perfect venue for the Philippines to communicate this demand for compensation, but that has been over and done with without this estimation from the Philippine bureaucracy. Now, he was also pressed as to why the Philippines does not have a provisional understanding with China, considering there are tensions in other maritime features in the South China Sea, including recently in the airspace over Scarborough Shoal, a common fishing ground, as ruled by a 2016 arbitral tribunal, as well as the swarming of Chinese vessels, what think tanks call cabbage strategy in Sabina Shoal, which is the closest significant maritime feature in the South China Sea to the Philippine island of Palawan. But the secretary said that, or hailed instead, the provisional understanding between the Philippines and China in Second Thomas Shoal, locally known as Ayungin Shoal, and he was saying that that understanding was important, even if there are no other agreements in other maritime features, because the rotation and resupply missions of the Philippines are focused there in terms of bringing provisions to the troops stationed in BRP Sierra Madre, which is a grounded World War II ship in that shoal. He also said that or didn't want to downplay the importance of that provisional understanding, even if there was a war of words previously between China and the Philippines saying that China has been mischaracterizing, requiring the Philippines to give prior notice for those resupply missions. But the secretary, despite this previous war of words, said that this provisional understanding is actually also unprecedented, because this is the first time that such an understanding has been undertaken by the Philippines and China in an important feature in the South China Sea.
Hey, many thanks for that report. Buena Banal in Manila. Meantime, a Beijing-based monitor says that the Philippines is sending one of its most advanced Coast Guard ships to a contested shoal in the South China Sea. The BRP Melchora Aquino is on its way to the Sabina Shoal in the Spratly Islands. That's according to the South China Sea Probing Initiative, and it's warning of a strong reaction from Beijing. The Aquino will relieve its sister ship, the Teresa Macbanua, which arrived at the site in April. Built in Japan, they are two of the Philippine Coast Guard's most expensive vessels. China has also sent its own ships to keep watch at the reef. The Sabina Shoal is within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, but China claims almost the entire South China Sea. Both sides are accusing each other of trying to build or carry out reclamation works on the reef. The Philippines held joint Coast Guard drills with Vietnam last week as tensions run high after a spate of incidents at sea with China in recent months. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi says that Beijing will support a democratic transition in Myanmar and a regional plan to resolve the crisis. The Myanmar military seized power in 2021 and has been fighting with pro-democracy forces and ethnic rebels since. Mr. Wang's comments came after he met with General Min Aung Hlaing in the war-torn country this week. Reports say China has promised support and aid for conducting a census, followed by an election that is planned for next year. In Thailand for a regional meeting, Mr. Wang said that China would support a peace plan for Myanmar, agreed to by the ASEAN states. Myanmar has been excluded from ASEAN meetings after the government failed to take action on the so-called five-point consensus. And these include the cessation of violence and dialogue among all parties concerned.
中方愿同各方一道，发出支持缅甸止战维稳、保障人民安全、反对外来干涉的共同的声音。东盟大家庭不能缺少缅甸。
China says that it will begin screening arrivals for Mpox as cases begin to spread outside of Africa. The move comes after an infection of the new Mpox strain that was detected in Sweden yesterday. Pakistan says it has confirmed its first case this year in a man from a Gulf country, but the strain of the virus is still unclear. Chinese customs authorities say that all aircraft and vessels, including cargo and container ships, arriving from countries that have reported infections will need to comply with health processing measures. Travelers will have to declare whether they have been in contact with symptomatic people and if they're experiencing any symptoms themselves. Containers and goods from countries with infections will be sanitized. Now, these measures will be in place for at least the next 6 months. Authorities in Taiwan and Hong Kong are also taking preemptive measures. Taiwan's Center for Disease Control raised its travel alert for the Democratic Republic of Congo and 6 other African countries. The CDC also noted that they have enough Mpox vaccine doses for 80,000 people. Hong Kong has activated the lowest level of its 3-tier alert system, saying that being aware is the only way to prevent a cluster of infections. The city has reported 67 Mpox cases since the first was found in 2022. Well, governments around the world are bracing for a potential outbreak after the UN Health Agency declared Mpox a global public health emergency for the second time in 2 years. It follows an outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo that's claimed more than 540 lives this year. Mpox clade 1 is a more dangerous variant of the Mpox disease. It spreads through close contact. The symptoms include fever and skin lesions. The disease has spread to at least a dozen other countries in Africa.
This one is spreading very rapidly, and it's spread to countries in Africa that have never seen it before, such as Rwanda, Kenya, Burundi. We're seeing a lot of cases in Burundi and also in Uganda. And these are countries that have got a lot of contact with the rest of the world. But so that's a threat to the rest of the world. But it's really because it's spreading so rapidly, causing so many more cases than we've seen. We've seen in this half year more cases than we saw all of last year. And last year we saw more cases than we were seeing before.
We're time now for a short break, but coming up next on East Asia tonight, the yen carry trade returning with a vengeance. Just weeks after its unwinding, it was blamed for a meltdown in global stock markets. And more sobering economic data out of China. The jobless rate for 16 to 24-year-olds rising to the highest since last December. More details next. again. Good to have your company on East Asia tonight this Friday. Well, it is time now for your business update with none other than Roland Lim. So, Roland, Nikkei in the spotlight again, I believe, almost 2 weeks after slumping by the most since, 1987?
That's right, Sally, but for the exact opposite reason. Now, they're in focus this time for their advances. Strong U.S. retail sales data soothed fears of a recession for Japan's biggest trading partner. The Nikkei 225 surging 3.6%, posting its second biggest daily gain this year. And that brings its increase this week to more than 8%. That's the most since April of 2020. The broader Topics Index also adding about 3%. The Japanese yen slipped to around 149 level. Now, since the 5th August stock meltdown, it has weakened more than 5% against the greenback. And that's leading hedge funds to pile into the yen carry trade again. Remember, carry trade is when investors borrow a low-yielding asset to invest in those that give high returns. Japan's biggest brokerage, Nomura, has seen a notable pickup in carry trade since the 5th of August. The unwinding of these trades was to blame for the historic 12.4% slump in the Nikkei that day. Now, traders have once again started to borrow the yen to invest in the Australian dollar and pound sterling. One of the key questions for investors still sitting on the sidelines is whether the Bank of Japan will hike interest rates again this year. Now, China's central bank chief Pan Gongsheng has vowed further steps to support the nation's economic recovery. However, he cautions against adopting, quote, drastic measures. His comments in state media comes a day after key indicators suggest lackluster growth last month amid weak domestic demand and a prolonged property downturn. Referring to the deflationary pressures in China, Mr. Pan says that the PBOC will maintain a supportive monetary policy stance. It will maintain price stability and promote moderate price recovery. The bank will also be placing more emphasis on the role of tools such as interest rates to adjust prices. Now, on the property sector, he said, the PBOC is planning to launch a re-lending program to help fund local government purchases of unsold homes. Analysts say they are expecting the PBOC to further trim interest rates to prop up growth at a time when the U.S. Federal Reserve is widely expected to cut borrowing costs next month. Independent research firm Evercore ISI says that the PBOC's decision will depend on China's economic performance in the third quarter. It sees the central bank lowering rates by as much as 30 basis points by year end. And sentiment in Greater China markets improved following reports of the PBOC governor's interview. Hang Seng Index closed higher, boosted by tech stocks, advancing 1.9% nearly. However, Shanghai and Shenzhen pared back from earlier gains given the lack of specific stimulus measures. Turning to shares of Alibaba, they jumped nearly 5% in Hong Kong. That's even after the e-commerce giant missed consensus for first quarter revenue as consumers limit their spending. Fueling gains are expectations it'll join the Stock Connect next month, which will allow mainland investors to trade directly. Analysts say this could drive as much as $20 billion into the stock next year. JD.com also soaring as much as 9%. The Alibaba rival reported positive report card, beating profit forecasts. Now, David Chow from Invesco Asia Pacific spoke to CNA's Liz Neo about the disconnect between market expectations and what policymakers can do to help revive China's economy.
Well, I think that there's a bit of a disconnect. Markets certainly want to see a more muscly type of stimulus, both from the PBOC and from fiscal stimulus. But at the same time, I think that policymakers in Beijing, growth in China in Q1 was better than expected. Growth in Q2 was a little behind. And so I think that policymakers are unlikely to fire off any kind of significant stimulus measures, but we'll likely still see some drips and drabs of measures, either more property market easing. But I don't think that we're in a situation where significant stimulus is required.
It's comforting for the Chinese economy, I suppose. Meantime, China is contributing quite significantly to Singapore's key exports. So Nodex figures that came out at the 8 o'clock hour, we saw that it rebounded pretty dramatically by more than 15% from June's contraction of more than 8%. That's thanks to China, US, and Malaysia. Your reaction to, of course, the latest NODX figures?
Sure, I wouldn't say like 1 month's data calls for a trend, and we continue to see a bit of unevenness there. I think that what's going on is that, the European economy perhaps is growing better than expected. U.S. economy is slowing a bit. China is showing some bit of unevenness. Asia continues to be somewhat resilient. And so I think there continues to be a bit of unevenness from a macro backdrop.
So you're saying that this may not be something that we could see in subsequent months?
That's right. I'm not sure that I'd call, the coming months to see continued strong exports from Singapore. There could be a bit of unevenness there.
Economic data out from China, the jobless rate rose to its highest since last December when authorities changed the methodology. Employers in the lackluster $19 trillion economy held off on hiring as the outlook remained downbeat. The Statistics Bureau says the jobless rate for 16 to 24-year-olds, excluding students, rose to 17.1% in July. That's from 13.2% in June. Now, around 12 million students graduated this summer. However, even as roles in remote rural areas attracting young Chinese with diplomas from top universities, aspiring professionals face the toughest jobs market in years. Youth unemployment hit a record high of 21.3% in June last year. Now, this prompted China to stop publishing the closely watched data, saying students still enrolled should be excluded. China's market regulator said that German automaker BMW and its Chinese joint venture will recall a total of 1.36 million cars. China's State Administration for Market Regulation named potential risks with the Takata airbag as the reason. The recalls will be for cars produced in China and imported into the country. Effective immediately, they will include models produced between 2003 and 2017. The regulator said that the vehicles confirmed to have defects after inspection. BMW will replace the driver's airbags free of charge to eliminate safety hazards. Now, BMW China did not immediately respond to Reuters' request for comment. Some of Asia's biggest tech firms, including SoftBank Group, will reportedly join a fund aimed at making quick investments in AI startups. According to Nikkei Asia, conglomerates from South Korea and Thailand have recently signed a pact to join a $130 million fund by the end of this month. The Alpha Intelligence Fund counts the younger brother of SoftBank CEO Masayoshi Son as one of its founders. Apart from SoftBank, SK Networks, LG Electronics, and Hanwha Financial from South Korea, plus a Thai conglomerate, have also committed to join. The fund is in discussions with other firms in East and Southeast Asia, with plans to expand to around $200 million by year end. The fund will target middle-stage startups with AI spanning fields such as healthcare, robotics, and software as a service. Now, venture capital funds are struggling to keep up with the rapid growth of startups using generative AI to expand their services. Meantime, the investment needed for AI startups to stay competitive has exploded. Taizo Son, that's the brother of the SoftBank CEO, had said it's structurally difficult for venture capital firms to meet such aggressive investment demand. And that's all the business news I have for you. Otelli.
Thanks so very much, Roland. Well, we're going to go for another short break, but coming up next on East Asia Tonight, work to remove nuclear waste from Japan's Fukushima power plant could start this month. We speak to an expert on the challenges of this operation. Typhoon Ampil lashing Japan, with the public warned to stay on the alert for violent winds, high waves, floods, and mudslides. Hundreds of flights have been cancelled, affecting more than 100,000 passengers. The Philippines Foreign Affairs Secretary says his country's external engagements are for defense and not aimed at any other country. His comment comes amid tensions with Beijing over competing claims in the South China Sea. And China's top diplomat Wang Yi pledges support for a democratic transition in Myanmar and backs a regional plan to resolve its ongoing crisis. And one of the most challenging tasks in decommissioning Japan's wrecked Fukushima nuclear power plant is about to get underway. Well, operator TEPCO plans to start removing radioactive debris at one of the 3 reactors as early as this month. Now, you may recall that in March 2011, a magnitude 9 quake and tsunami struck Japan. Well, that knocked out the Fukushima facility's cooling system, leaving tons of melted nuclear fuel inside the plant to this day. Under plans drawn up by the government and TEPCO, work to remove the melted fuel was scheduled to start in 2021, but the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as technical problems, pushed back the process a number of times. Well, the operation will involve inserting a remote-controlled extendable pipe into the reactor containment vessel to remove tiny bits of melted fuel. And as a first step, TEPCO is looking to retrieve just a few grams of waste from one reactor where radiation levels are relatively low. Now, this trial process is expected to take around 2 weeks, but there is still no clear roadmap on how to remove an estimated 880 tons of fuel debris across all 3 units that suffered meltdowns. Some critics say the cleanup target of 30 to 40 years could be overly optimistic. Well, for more insight, we are joined now by Dr. Ian McKinley, Director of McKinley Consulting, and he joins us from Baden, Switzerland. Well, also, not to mention that Professor's a PhD in radiochemistry, so I'm sure he knows a thing or two about radioactive debris. So first up, Professor, help us understand this. What are some of the biggest challenges when it comes to removing this highly radioactive debris from these sites? And we have seen some really devastating images of destroyed nuclear reactors, and it's certainly not an easy task, is it?
Yes, well, the real challenge is to remove the melted down fuel. This is the most radioactive material, and there is very little experience in handling this kind of stuff. So the work that is planned at the present moment is very much the first stage of just getting a bit more understanding of what this material is like and how we will be able to remove it from the reactors.
And there are reports saying that only 3 grams of nuclear material can be removed at a time using a mechanical claw. Can you explain to us why is it that we can't scale up this process? I mean, you've mentioned that, there's very little experience involved in handling such an operation. And are there more reasons to that?
Yes, well, this really is an experimental test of equipment to see how they can cut and how they can remove this very highly radioactive material. At the present moment, we have got very little understanding of its mechanical properties, how strong it is, how variable the composition is. And so the first stages are very much research to get better understanding of what the material is like. Once we know that, we can then plan in more detail how we're going to move further with the major job of taking the large quantities of melted fuel out of the buildings.
So we're also getting wildly different timelines for the nuclear debris removal. Some are saying 30 to 40 years, while some other scientists are saying perhaps even 100 years. So which one should we believe, Professor?
The difficulty here is the balance between politics and science. The Japanese government would like this to move ahead as quickly as possible. So they are talking about 30, 40 years. The scientific community would prefer to move a bit more slowly. This is because with time, a lot of the radiation decays away, the shorter-lived radionuclides, and so it becomes much easier and safer to do the dismantling of the damaged reactor. For example, in the UK, there was a major reactor accident in the mid-50s, and then they decided to wait for 80 years before even starting to take the core apart. So this is a very short timescale. It is probably doable because the technology has developed, but it would be easier if they slowed things down and allowed for more radioactivity to decay in place.
So, Professor, as you've mentioned that there is even a possibility that there could be a pause, within this timeline. But it keeps changing, though, right? Whether it's 40 years or 100 years. So, how then can we ensure that this project can be completed without becoming, I suppose, a perpetual drain on public resources?
The financial side is tricky. In principle, the longer the project goes on for, the more expensive. But on the other hand, nuclear projects are by their very nature long-term. The disposal facility for high-level nuclear waste in Japan, so the normal waste from the reactors, it will probably only be operational in 20 years or 30 years, and that will operate for at least 40 years. And so it's going to be a century before you close that repository. So these timescales are quite normal in the nuclear waste management business. It isn't anything very strange.
All right. And, Professor, I don't mean to be a Debbie Down on a Friday, but I have to ask, what is the worst case scenario if something happens to go wrong during this process? I mean, what are some of the potential consequences for the surrounding area and as well as, I guess more importantly, the people living nearby?
The advantage of the reactors at the present moment is that most of the radioactivity is contained within the reactor pressure vessel. And this is actually very stable. And basically, you could, if you want, put a shelter around it and leave it for 50 years. It would be completely safe. The major problem on the site is all of the liquid waste, which is stored there. So there's a large amount of liquid waste in tanks. That will gradually, some of the waste will be released to sea, some of the radioactivity will be taken out of the water and stored. But this is actually more of a contamination risk than the radioactivity within the reactors. So my major concern would be a major earthquake, a major typhoon hitting the site, causing some damage. But even then, it's only the smaller amount of radioactivity that is in the tanks that is vulnerable. The radioactivity that's within the reactor buildings is almost completely safe. It's difficult to imagine anything that could cause major contamination from the reactors themselves.
Yeah, that's certainly comforting to know. But what about all the other, the contaminated soil and the rubble? We hear that the disposal methods are still unclear. So in your opinion, what are some of the best ways or method to handle this stuff, and are we close to figuring it out?
The best method, scientifically, the best method would be to have underground disposal on or near the site. And this technology is very, very well established. It's operating all around the world and would be no problem. But again, politics comes in. The Japanese government have decided that they're going to take all of this waste away from the site. That will be expensive. It will then have to be moved, packaged for movement, and they have to find somewhere to put the waste. So technically, it is crazy, but there is no connection between what is sensible from a scientific point of view and the decisions made by government. If the government want to do it, it is feasible, but it will be much more expensive.
All right, Professor, really appreciate you explaining such a complex issue for simpler minds like us. Thanks so very much for your time, Dr. Ian McKinley, Director of McKinley Consulting, speaking to us from Switzerland. South Korea's main subway system, Seoul Metro, has been slammed for removing a replica of the Liancourt rocks. Disputed territory Seoul calls Dokdo and Tokyo refers to as Fukushima. Well, these miniature models were originally installed in high-traffic parts of Seoul Metro to educate the public and counter Japan's claims to the islets. But just days before the 79th anniversary of Korea's liberation from colonial Japan, they were removed from several stations. Officials explained this was to ensure better safety with a rise in travelers passing by the area. but many in the public have raised eyebrows, saying that the timing was uncanny. The models had been there since 2009 and nobody had filed any safety complaints. And many went on social media criticizing Seoul City for siding with the Yoon administration's pro-Japan stance. Like many conservative parties in the past, the Yoon administration has been accused of overlooking unsettled historical disputes with Japan. Yesterday's National Liberation Day was by far the most polarized yet. Civic groups and opposition parties boycotted a government ceremony and held their own Liberation Day event. And in response to that uproar, Seoul Metro said it would upgrade and reinstall the Dokdo structures. The disputed islets lie halfway between South Korea and Japan. South Korea restored its sovereignty over Dokdo ever since the peninsula was liberated from colonial Japan. North Korea and Russia have reaffirmed their growing ties as Pyongyang marks the 79th anniversary of its independence from Japan's colonial rule. Kim Jong-un said that friendly relations between the two nations have deepened in a, quote, bloody struggle against the common enemy. The leader exchanged a message with his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, pledging to bolster cooperation. State media KCNA said that Mr. Kim hailed bonds with Moscow as a strong force amid a multipolarized new world. Mr. Putin congratulated North Korea for its liberation anniversary earlier this week and said agreements reached during his summit with Mr. Kim in June would be thoroughly implemented. The U.S., South Korea and their allies have raised concerns about growing ties between Russia and North Korea. Washington has accused Pyongyang of supplying Moscow with artillery and weapons for use in its war in Ukraine. Mr. Kim, meantime, has visited flood victims who have been relocated from provinces hit by extreme weather. More than 15,000 people are being temporarily housed in Pyongyang while their homes are being restored. The leader delivered a welcome speech to the families and visited a dining hall for children. Prior to this, the North Korean leader has also visited the impacted areas to oversee rescue and relief work. Efforts to rebuild homes could take up to 3 months. And despite the significant losses in farmland and housing, North Korea has rejected international aid, including offers from Seoul. He slammed South Korean reports that an estimated 1,500 people are either dead or missing, calling them a smear campaign. Pyongyang has not released casualty figures. And turning our focus to Thailand, its parliament has elected Paetongtarn Shinawatra, the daughter of former leader Thaksin Shinawatra, to become the next prime minister. Well, her election caps 72 hours of rapid-fire developments in Thai politics. In a special parliament session today, 493 lawmakers of the House of Representatives voted on the sole candidate by the ruling coalition. And thanks to a comfortable majority, Ms. Paetongtarn was quick to secure the necessary number to be confirmed as the next prime minister. Ms. Paetongtarn herself monitored the proceedings from the Pheu Thai party headquarters, where she then spoke to the media.
To do my best in every day and in every opportunities that I have. I think that's make me feel like, of course, like, there's a lot of things going on around me, but if I always do my best and always think about what is happening right now, right here in front of my face, I will be fine.
Ms. Paetongtarn replaces Prime Minister Sethatawisin, who was dismissed by the Constitutional Court for ethical misconduct in his nomination of a cabinet minister with a criminal record. At age 37, she will be the youngest Prime Minister of Thailand, while she's also the third Shinawatra to serve as the country's leader. Coming up on East Asia tonight, we look into the significance of Vietnamese leader Tho Lam's upcoming trip to Beijing. It's his first overseas visit since he was appointed head of the country's Communist Party. Vietnam's new leader, To Lam, will travel to Beijing this Sunday on a 3-day state visit. China is Mr. Lam's first overseas stop since he was appointed this month as the head of Vietnam's governing Communist Party. CNA's Tong No has more on why this meeting between the leaders is significant.
Mr. To Lam is the new face of Vietnam's next generation of leadership. At 66, he was sworn in as Vietnam's president in May, after which he paid visits to neighboring Laos and Cambodia. But the trip to China this Sunday is his first overseas stop since his appointment as the General Secretary of Vietnam's governing Communist Party, the country's highest political office, just 2 weeks ago.
The reason I emphasize the importance of the visits to Beijing by Secretary General and President To Lam, the visits in his both capacity as the party Secretary General and also the President, I think it also emphasizes the importance of the state-to-states and party-to-party relationships between Vietnam and China.
Vietnam's political power is shared among top 4 pillars: the General Secretary of the Communist Party, the President, Prime Minister, and the Chair of National Assembly, Vietnam's lawmaking body. Mr. Lam now occupies 2 of the 4 positions. He heads both the country and the governing Communist Party, like the Chinese President Xi Jinping does in Beijing. And as is the case in China now, Mr. Lam also holds Vietnam's highest military office as Secretary of the party's Central Military Commission, a position he naturally assumes as party chief. Vietnam's Foreign Minister Bùi Thanh Sơn told local media that the state visit to Beijing this time will be another milestone, opening a new period in Vietnam-China relations. Analysts say a key purpose of the visit is for the new Vietnamese top leader to establish a personal rapport with the Chinese leadership.
In Vietnam foreign policy, China plays a very important role, and Vietnam consider Vietnam-China relations as a strategic choice. They are very close neighbors. They also share a lot of similarities, including the structures of the political systems, and also because of Vietnam's geopolitical positions in the regions.
Vietnam's Communist Party lost its last General Secretary just last month, when old guard Mr. Nguyễn Phú Trọng died from illness. Mr. Lam, who was already then Vietnam's president, continued his rapid ascent among the governing elites. A decades-long veteran in Vietnam's public security apparatus, he went from being Vietnam's chief policeman to president and then the general secretary, all in less than 3 months. A new face in Vietnam's next generation of leadership. His most recent prominent engagement in foreign policy was in June, when he hosted in Hanoi President Putin of Russia, another country with strong historical ties to Vietnam. And with Mr. Xi, Mr. Lam will want to push forward the implementations of key agreements that his predecessors had sealed during the Chinese president's visit to Hanoi last December, especially the agreement of building a Vietnam-China community with a shared future.
I think this visit is very a symbolic one. And I don't think there is any breakthrough. And I think the visits also emphasize that Vietnam also views China as a strategic choice and a comprehensive strategic partnership. Secretary General and President To Lam also want to send a message that he wants to follow the legacy of the late Secretary General Nguyễn Phú Trọng.
Mr. Lam will also seek progress in areas of key economic cooperation with China, market access for Vietnam's agricultural products, high-quality investments, and the construction of high-speed rail lines connecting China to Hanoi and key Vietnamese port cities.
China is the largest trading partner of Vietnam. And of course, Vietnam is now still suffering a trade deficit. I think that's also one of the issues that might be discussed. The trade deficits between Vietnam and China now, it clearly shows that Vietnam's inputs for industrial products heavily relied on China.
The visit to China this time takes place amid rising tensions in the disputed waters. This year also marks the 10th year anniversary of an incident that sparked anti-China protests in Vietnam, spiking tensions between the two sides after Beijing placed an oil rig off Vietnam's coast. Bilateral tensions in the South China Sea has been relatively well contained since. In fact, observers note that in the past 2 years, Vietnam has stepped up construction there without apparent objection or interference from China. A key discussion in Beijing during Mr. Lam's visit to China will be to manage the maritime dispute.
Vietnam considers China as a strategic choice. And on the other hand, Vietnam considers the United States as a strategic priority. So, of course, we all see the rivalry between China and the US now is growing up. Vietnam want to keep the balance in the relationship between both countries because Vietnam's development really needs a very peaceful environment.
The visit of Mr. Lam to Beijing will also be closely watched by his domestic public, which holds deep suspicion of China because of centuries of wars against invaders from its northern neighbor throughout Vietnam's history.
Đối với Trung Quốc là ưu tiên số 1, quan hệ hữu nghị bao rộng giữ vững nhưng phải giữ ổn định, hòa bình ổn định Biển Đông. Thành ra giữ hòa bình ổn định thì lợi hơn. Chứ còn nhiều người các nói là ta không sợ Trung Quốc, đánh thì đánh, nhưng mà đánh thì tất nhiên là cũng thiệt hại, mà cũng có những cái như Ukraine bây giờ đấy, nhiều người ta nói bảo cái anh đấy phải học tập Việt Nam thì đất nước hòa bình mà vẫn giữ vững được bộ.
Vietnam's relation with its giant neighbor is a complex one, and Mr. Lam's upcoming visit will add a new chapter in the country's long shared history. Tùng Ngô, CNA, Hanoi.
And that's all we've got for you on East Asia tonight, this Friday. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia. And you can also look us up on Facebook, YouTube, and on X. Have a well-rested weekend.